It was a typical sunny afternoon in the suburban park where the air was fresh with the scent of blooming flowers. Families strolled, children played, and laughter echoed throughout the area. Among the visitors was Sarah, a young black woman walking with two children, Lily, 7, and Ethan, 5, who were the children of her close friends. Sarah had agreed to watch them for the day while their parents were at work. The children ran ahead, laughing and playing tag, carefree in the sun. For Sarah, it was just another afternoon in the park. She had grown accustomed to the curious glances and occasional stares from people who found it unusual to see a black woman with two white children. But she had learned to ignore them, focusing instead on the joy of spending time with the kids. It was a simple day of laughter, play, and enjoying the sunshine. What Sarah didn't realize was that two police officers, Harris and Willis, were patrolling the area nearby. The officers had been trained to notice things that didn't fit the usual pattern, and to them, the sight of Sarah with the two white children raised suspicion. In their minds, it was unusual and warranted investigation. The town they came from had little diversity, and the officers weren't used to seeing situations like this one. Officer Harris nudged his partner, pointing discreetly toward Sarah. "Do you see her?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "She shouldn't be with them." Willis frowned. "She's not their mother, right?" "We need to check it out," Harris insisted, and they began to walk toward Sarah. Sarah noticed them approaching, but assumed they were just making their routine rounds. When they reached her, Officer Harris stopped in front of her, blocking her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," Harris said, his voice firm. "We need to ask you a few questions. Is everything all right?" Sarah, slightly confused, nodded. "Yes, officer, everything is fine. I'm just watching the kids play." "Are they yours?" Harris asked, eyeing her closely. "No," Sarah responded, her unease growing. "I'm babysitting them today. They're my friend's kids." Officer Willis, who had been quiet, now spoke up. "And you're just walking around with two white kids?" His tone was skeptical. Sensing the hostility, Sarah tried to keep calm. "I'm their neighbor. I've been asked to help out for the day. That's it." The officers exchanged a glance. Harris pressed further. "We've received complaints about someone acting suspiciously with children who aren't theirs. We need to take this seriously." Sarah felt her heart race. The insinuation felt like an attack, and she couldn't understand why she was being treated this way. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" she asked, her voice now strained. The officers remained silent, their expressions hardening. Willis stepped closer, towering over her. "We're just doing our job," he said coldly. "We need to see some identification." Feeling trapped, Sarah reluctantly handed over her ID, but as she did, something unexpected happened. Lily, noticing the tension, walked up and tugged at Officer Harris's sleeve. The little girl, not fully understanding the situation, simply stated that Sarah was their trusted babysitter. Harris and Willis froze. The children's simple but sincere words pierced through the officers' prejudices. For a moment, their certainty faltered. The kids didn't see Sarah as anything other than their babysitter, someone they trusted, and yet the officers had treated her as a threat. Realizing their mistake, Harris muttered an apology, but it was too late. Sarah didn't need their apology. She turned to the children, telling them everything was fine, and began to walk away. The officers stood there, watching her leave, fully aware of their blunder. They had let their assumptions cloud their judgment, and in doing so, had exposed their own biases. But for Sarah, the moment was clear. No apology could undo what had just happened. The events of the day before continued to haunt Sarah. She had spent hours thinking about the encounter with the officers, replaying every word, every look, every second of the interaction. It wasn't just that she had been stopped, it was how it had felt. The suspicion, the judgment, the underlying assumption that she didn't belong. that somehow because of the color of her skin, she was in the wrong. The truth had never been clearer. She wasn't just a woman caring for children. She was a black woman caring for white children, and to some people, that was an anomaly, something to be questioned, something that didn't belong. Sarah tried to move past it, but it was impossible. She had grown accustomed to the subtle prejudices in her life, the stares, the whispers, but the way those officers treated her, the way they demanded answers for simply existing, made it impossible for her to ignore. And worse, the news report that followed only deepened the wound. It wasn't the truth. It wasn't the story she had lived. The officers' actions were framed as a misunderstanding, as if the fault lay with her for being questioned in the first place. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling heavier than usual. The sun had barely risen, but the weight of what had happened the day before still sat on her chest. She had planned to take it easy, to let the day pass without giving too much thought to the incident, but that was easier said than done. The day felt like it was going to be just like any other, until she checked her phone. A text message from Maria popped up. "Are you okay?" "I heard what happened with the cops." Sarah stared at the message for a moment, wondering how much to reveal. She had always tried to shield her friends and family from the ugly truths she faced. She didn't want to burden anyone, didn't want them to worry, but she knew Maria would want to know what had happened. Maria, a childhood friend who had always stood by her side, would never judge her. Sarah replied, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. "Yeah, I'm fine, just some cops being, well, you know." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. She didn't want to go into the details, didn't want to explain how it felt to be made to feel like a criminal when she was doing nothing more than caring for children. Sarah paused for a moment, looking out the window, watching the first light of the day creep over the horizon. It was as if the world was still asleep, unaware of the quiet rage that was slowly building inside her. Maria responded quickly, as she always did. "You need to talk? I'm here for you." Sarah looked at the message, considering it. She didn't want to burden Maria, but she knew her friend would want to hear the truth. With a sigh, Sarah typed, "I'll be okay, just processing things." But the truth was, Sarah wasn't okay, and she hadn't been okay for a long time. The truth wasn't just about this one encounter. It wasn't just about two officers in a park. It was about years of feeling like she didn't belong, like she was always one step away from being seen as other. She had been living her life, doing her best to make a difference, to be a good person. But it felt like every time she succeeded, there was a reminder that no matter what she did, she wasn't seen as equal. Not really. The next few hours passed in a blur of routine. She went to work, helped her neighbors with errands, and made a mental note to pick up groceries, but in the back of her mind, the thought of the police officers lingered. The way they had looked at her, their dismissive attitudes, the way they assumed she was in the wrong, without ever giving her a chance to explain. She couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, as Sarah sat down with a cup of tea, she turned on the news. The story from the park was still being covered. The officers had issued a statement explaining that they had approached Sarah because of a report they had received. The news anchor mentioned that the situation had been misunderstood and that the officers had apologized for any inconvenience caused. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't the truth. They hadn't apologized because they had made a mistake. They apologized because they had been caught. They hadn't seen her as a person. They had seen her as a threat simply because of her skin color. The report didn't address the real issue, the bias, the suspicion, the prejudice. It made it seem like she was the problem, like she had done something to provoke their suspicion. Her phone buzzed again, and Sarah glanced down. It was a message from her mom. "Sweetheart, I saw the news. Are you all right?" Sarah hesitated before replying. She knew her mother would worry. She didn't want to put that burden on her. She typed quickly, "I'm fine, Mom. Don't worry about it." But inside, Sarah knew the truth. She was far from fine. She was tired of always having to fight, of always being judged by a standard she didn't create. She was tired of feeling like she had to prove herself again and again to people who never gave her a chance. She had worked hard to get where she was. She had earned her place in this world, yet it felt like the world was always trying to push her back. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let this moment define her, but she wasn't going to let it go either. The next time someone looked at her and judged her, the next time she was treated like she didn't belong, she was going to speak up. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small anymore. The world had tried to keep her in a box. It had tried to tell her that she wasn't enough. But Sarah knew now that she was more than enough. She had nothing to prove to anyone except to herself. The following morning, Sarah couldn't shake off the tension that had lingered since the encounter in the park. It had felt like an ordinary day, a simple errand with the children, yet it had turned into a whirlwind of discomfort, doubt, and unwanted attention. As she went about her day, the events replayed in her mind. The officers' suspicious eyes, the accusations, the way they treated her like a stranger. She had been living in this neighborhood for years, doing nothing but being a good neighbor, a good friend. But the harsh reality of what happened made her realize that, for some, she would never be good enough. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the incident. She felt humiliated not just by the officer's questions, but by the underlying assumption that she was guilty of something. For once, it wasn't about being judged for what she had done, but simply for who she was, her skin, her presence. The media coverage didn't help. The news reports seemed to play down the real issue, framing it as a misunderstanding. The officers had claimed they were simply doing their job. Yet, in Sarah's mind, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was about a deeper, ingrained prejudice that permeated the system. It was a reminder of how easy it was for people like her to be scrutinized, to be judged without reason. As Sarah walked through her neighborhood later that afternoon, she noticed the subtle stares. It wasn't overt. People didn't confront her or say anything directly, but it was there. The way people turned their heads when she walked by, the whispers behind closed doors. She wasn't naive enough to think that no one noticed her. A black woman walking alone in a predominantly white neighborhood was bound to draw attention. But the way people reacted after the incident, it felt like they were looking at her differently. It wasn't just the neighbors. Sarah had worked in customer service for years, always maintaining a professional demeanor, making sure her clients felt at ease. But now, even in the office, things had started to shift. Her co-workers were distant, more guarded, like they were unsure how to act around her now. She had always prided herself on being friendly and approachable, but now it felt like her presence was a disruption. The message was clear. She didn't fit. She didn't belong. But Sarah wasn't the type to let this consume her. She had dealt with prejudice before in small, everyday ways. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just one rude comment or one small action that made her feel out of place. This time, it was systemic. It was the weight of centuries of bias, wrapped up in one single interaction. It was the idea that simply because of her race, she was seen as less than, as someone who didn't deserve to be in the spaces she occupied. At home that night, as she scrolled through her phone, she saw the news coverage again. It was clear that the story was going to fade away. Just another instance of a black person being mistreated and brushed aside. But for Sarah, this wasn't just another headline. It was a wake-up call. It was a reminder that despite everything she had accomplished, despite all the times she had risen above the challenges thrown her way, there were still people who saw her as less than. There were still people who saw her as an outsider. The thought stung. But Sarah wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let herself be silenced, to let this incident be swept under the rug. There was no way she was going to let the officers or anyone else define her. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let one small moment take away her sense of self-worth. As the night wore on, Sarah made a decision. She would not let this injustice slip by unnoticed. She would not let this story fade into the background. She would speak up. She would make sure people understood the harm that this kind of bias could cause. She would make sure that her voice was heard. The next day, Sarah made her way to the local community center. She had heard about a support group for people who had experienced discrimination, and she decided to attend. It wasn't easy for her to open up, to admit that she had been affected by what had happened, but she knew she wasn't alone. There were others out there who understood, others who had been through the same thing. As she walked into the room, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. There were people there who had faced similar struggles, who had fought similar battles. They weren't strangers to the pain she had felt. They knew the weight of living in a world where the color of your skin determined your place. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she wasn't alone. And as she sat down to share her story, she realized that this wasn't just about one encounter with two officers. This was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for herself, for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. Sarah wasn't just going to accept it anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone make her feel small. She was going to fight back. She was going to stand tall, and she was going to make sure that people like her were heard. The world had tried to break her down, but Sarah knew deep down that she would only come out stronger. This was just the beginning. The days that followed the incident with the officers were filled with a mix of emotions for Sarah. There were moments of quiet reflection where she would sit alone, replaying the events in her mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then there were moments of intense frustration where she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, reminding her of the deep, systemic issues that she couldn't ignore any longer. But the most overwhelming feeling was the sense of isolation. The more she reflected on the incident, the more she realized that this wasn't just an isolated case. It wasn't just about two officers who had treated her unfairly. It was a much bigger problem, one that ran deep in society and institutions and in the way people saw her because of her skin color. It was everywhere, in the casual looks of distrust, in the assumptions that were made before she even opened her mouth, in the way she had been stopped that day for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The media, of course, had long moved on. The story of the two officers and the black woman they had accosted had faded from the headlines, replaced by something else, something newer. That was the way it always worked, wasn't it? One incident was swept away to make room for another, leaving behind no trace except for the scars it had left on the people who had been involved. But Sarah couldn't move on, not this time. She couldn't just let it go. She knew that in the grand scheme of things, her encounter might have seemed trivial to some. But for her, it had been a reminder, a brutal, sobering reminder of how deep the biases ran in society. She couldn't erase the feeling of being judged before she even had the chance to explain herself. The way the officers had looked at her, like she didn't belong, like she was a criminal by default. And it wasn't just the officers. It was the way people in her neighborhood looked at her now, with that subtle, knowing glance. It was the way her co-workers seemed to treat her with more distance, as if she were suddenly other. That feeling of being watched, of being judged, followed her everywhere. It was the kind of thing that slowly gnawed at you until you couldn't shake it. The feeling of not being allowed to simply exist, to take up space without suspicion. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Maria, her closest friend. "Hey Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened. You want to talk? You know I'm here for you." Sarah hesitated before replying. She had been avoiding Maria's messages for a while. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk to her friend. It was that she didn't know how to explain the weight of what she was feeling. How could she explain to Maria that the incident with the officers wasn't just a mistake, that it wasn't just about one bad encounter? How could she explain the quiet, insidious prejudice that she had carried with her every day of her life? But Maria was more than a friend. She was a support, a lifeline. Sarah knew she couldn't keep bottling up everything inside, so she typed back, "I think we should talk. Maybe later?" Her phone dinged with Maria's reply almost immediately. "Let me know when you're free." "I'm just a call away." Later that afternoon, they met up at their favorite cafe. The familiar, cozy atmosphere was a welcome distraction for Sarah. She felt herself relax as they sat down, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. But as Maria looked at her, concern etched across her face, Sarah knew the conversation would be far from ordinary. "You don't have to tell me everything, Sarah," Maria said softly, her voice comforting, "but I can see it in your eyes. Something's weighing on you." Sarah took a deep breath. She wasn't sure where to start. The words felt heavy on her tongue, but she knew she couldn't keep them inside anymore. "Maria, it wasn't just about that day. It's not just about what happened in the park," Sarah began, her voice shaky but determined. "It's how they treated me, how they assumed things about me just because of who I am. I wasn't even given a chance to explain myself, and after it happened, it felt like nothing. Like it didn't even matter to anyone else. The news moved on, the officers moved on, but I can't. I can't forget how they looked at me like I didn't belong." Maria's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to hold Sarah's hand. "You're right, it's not just about what happened that day, it's about everything that led up to it, everything that we face every day. You don't have to carry this alone, okay?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She had been holding it in for so long, trying to appear strong, trying to act like it didn't affect her. But now, with Maria's words, it felt like a dam had broken inside her. "I'm tired, Maria," Sarah whispered. "Tired of fighting, tired of feeling like I have to prove myself all the time. I'm just so tired of being seen as less than. And I can't change how people look at me, no matter how hard I try." Maria squeezed her hand. "You don't have to change, Sarah. You're not the one who needs to change. The world needs to change, and we're going to make sure that happens." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't alone. She had her friends, her family, and now her voice. She didn't know exactly how she was going to make a difference, but she knew that she couldn't just sit back anymore. The fight wasn't over. The following week felt like a blur. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of a whirlwind of emotions. She had made the decision to take action, but now that the weight of that decision, Sarah spent the next few days reflecting on her options. She had already reached out to the community center, where a support group for individuals who had faced discrimination met regularly. That was one step, but it wasn't enough. She knew that speaking out within the safety of the support group wouldn't be enough to create real change. The public needed to hear her story. The world needed to understand what had happened, not just to her, but to anyone who had been unjustly treated based on their race. But there was also fear. Fear of being silenced, fear of retaliation, fear that despite Sarah knew, she couldn't go through this alone. Maria had been a constant source of support, but she needed more than just emotional reassurance. She needed to make sure that the next time someone tried to silence her, she had the tools to fight back. It was late one evening when Sarah received a call from an unexpected number. It was from the lawyer she had contacted the day after the incident. "Ms. Davis," the voice on the other end asked, sounding calm but urgent. "This is Attorney Harris. I've reviewed the incident with the officers. and I believe you have grounds for a case. You don't have to go through this alone." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had always known there was something wrong about the way she was treated, but hearing those words, "grounds for a case," made everything feel more real. This was no longer just about her personal experience. This was about something bigger. This was about taking a stand. "I've been reading through the details, and I think we can build a strong case against the officers involved," Harris continued. "We'll need to gather your testimony, witness statements, and anything else you can provide. I'll help you through this process." For a moment, Sarah was silent, overwhelmed by the implications of the call. She had always hoped that the world would change on its own, that things would gradually get better, but now it was clear that if she wanted change, she would have to be the one to make it happen. "I'm in," Sarah finally said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The next few days were filled with meetings, paperwork, and an overwhelming amount of legal jargon that Sarah struggled to understand. But what kept her going was the knowledge that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for every person who had been judged before they even had a chance to explain themselves. She wasn't just a woman standing up to two officers. She was a voice for the voiceless. As the case began to take shape, Sarah started to feel a sense of empowerment that she had never experienced before. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting to the injustice that had been done to her. She was actively working to correct it. The road ahead was long, and there were still many hurdles to overcome. But Sarah was determined to keep moving forward. But the decision to take legal action came with its own set of challenges. The story quickly gained attention in the media, and not all of it was positive. Some people were quick to criticize her, questioning whether she was over Rhea. The scrutiny was difficult, but Sarah was ready for it. She had to remind herself that this wasn't about what others thought of her. It wasn't about the trolls on social media or the critics who would never understand what it was like to live in her shoes. This was about holding people accountable for their actions. This was about showing the world that you couldn't just treat people however you wanted because of the color of their skin. At the same time, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about breaking down the systems of prejudice and bias that had been in place for so long. It was about opening people's eyes to the realities of racism, to the ways it silently shaped the world around them. But Sarah knew this wasn't a fight she could back down from. The world needed to see what she had gone through. The officers needed to be held accountable for what they had done. And in a larger sense, the world needed to be reminded that prejudice had no place in society. Sarah had spent so much of her life silently carrying the burden of being misunderstood. But now she was no longer going to stand quietly in the background. She was going to make sure the world knew her name, and that it would never forget the lessons she was about to teach. As Sarah stepped into the courthouse, a feeling of resolve washed over her. The weight of what she was about to do felt both empowering and terrifying. For years, she had been living with the silent burden of racial prejudice, quietly absorbing the injustices and systemic bias she encountered. But today, she wasn't going to stay silent. Today, she was going to make sure that the world heard her story. The moment she walked into the courthouse, Sarah was greeted by her attorney, Ben Harris, who had been working tirelessly to prepare the case. His demeanor was calm, but there was a noticeable tension in his voice as he briefed her on what to expect in the coming days. He reassured her that they had a solid case, but the road ahead would be difficult. Legal battles were rarely easy, especially when the opposition was well established as it was in this case. "You're doing the right thing," Ben said, offering a supportive smile. "This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. This is about making sure people are held accountable for their actions." Sarah nodded, but inside, she felt a knot of anxiety. She had lived her whole life fighting quiet battles in the shadows. Now she was stepping into the light, where her fight would be on full display. The media had already picked up on the case, and rumors swirled about her being troublesome or looking for attention. But she knew this was bigger than her. This was about confronting the deeply entrenched prejudices that had shaped her life and the lives of countless others. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Sarah found herself in and out of meetings with her attorney, providing witness statements and recounting the events from that fateful day in the park. The legal team worked tirelessly, collecting evidence, reaching out to people who had witnessed the interaction between Sarah and the officers, and preparing for what promised to be a challenging court case. Despite all the preparations, there was a constant undercurrent of uncertainty. Would the jury understand? Would they believe her? The doubt that crept in, especially as she saw the media reports spin the story in ways that didn't align with her experience, made her question whether this would ever lead to real change. But every time Sarah felt like giving up, Maria's words echoed in her mind. The world needs to see what's happening. Your voice matters, and you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of us. One afternoon, as Sarah reviewed the evidence with Ben in the office, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the message, surprised to see that it was from someone she didn't recognize. It was a reporter from the local news station. "Hi, Ms. Davis. We'd like to do an interview regarding the case. Your story is important, and we believe it can bring attention to the systemic issues we need to address. Please let us know if you're available for a discussion." For a brief moment, Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open herself up to public scrutiny. The last few weeks had been exhausting, and the thought of sharing her personal story with the entire world felt overwhelming. But then she remembered what had driven her to this point, her need to be heard, to be understood, and to make sure that the world saw the full picture. She took a deep breath, glanced at Ben, and nodded. "I'll do it." The interview was scheduled for the following afternoon. When Sarah arrived at the station, she was escorted into a small studio where the camera was already set up. The reporter, a woman named Carla, introduced herself and immediately set a reassuring tone. She asked Sarah to share her story, to explain what had happened that day and why it was so important. As the camera rolled, Sarah's words began to flow more easily than she had expected. She spoke honestly about the fear, the frustration, and the hurt she felt when the officers had stopped her. She talked about the racial assumptions that had colored their perception of her, and how the aftermath of the incident had left her feeling isolated. Most importantly, she talked about how much she wanted change, not just for herself, but for all those who had been unjustly targeted, treated as other, or dismissed based on their skin color. By the time the interview ended, Sarah felt a sense of catharsis. For the first time in a long time, she had spoken her truth out loud, and the weight that had been pressing down on her seemed just a little lighter. But as she left the studio, the reality of what she had done hit her. Her story was out there now for the world to see. She wasn't just a woman fighting a personal battle anymore. She was a voice for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The media coverage was intense. The local news picked up her story, and soon it spread to larger outlets. People started to listen. She began to receive messages from people she didn't know, people who shared their own experiences of prejudice, people who thanked her for speaking out, people who felt that her courage had given them hope. But not everyone was supportive. There were those who criticized Sarah for making a big deal out of something they saw as a misunderstanding. Some said she should have just let it go. But as Sarah read the messages, as she saw the support pouring in from others who had faced similar struggles, she knew she had made the right choice. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a future where no one would have to go through what she had. And even though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, Sarah knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. As the weeks went by, Sarah's life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. The media coverage of her case continued to grow, and with it came a complex wave of attention. There were interviews, debates, and more stories, each one focusing on the same question: would the officers be held accountable? But as Sarah's public profile increased, so did the scrutiny, not just on the case, but on her personal life. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some full of support, others full of hate. She had never expected to become. But Sarah wasn't backing down. She couldn't afford to. As much as the pressure weighed on her, she knew that it was the price of speaking up. She had become a symbol for something bigger than herself, and that was both empowering and terrifying. She leaned heavily on the support of Maria, who had been her rock throughout this entire ordeal. Every evening after a long day of media interviews and legal meetings, Maria would call, offering a listening ear or a comforting word. Maria reminded Sarah to take breaks, to rest, and to focus on the positive. She needed those calls, those moments of normalcy. One evening after a particularly exhausting day, Sarah received a call from Edward. The tone in his voice was different, more urgent. "Sarah, I need you to come down to the office. We've got something important to discuss." Her heart skipped a beat. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Edward's voice was steady but firm. "We've received new information. It's about the officers involved in your case. Something's changed, and we need to talk about next steps." A chill ran through Sarah as she gathered her things and headed out the door. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal preparations and media coverage, and now it seemed like things were reaching a boiling point. She had known that the officers wouldn't go down easily, but something about the way Edward spoke made her uneasy. When Sarah arrived at Edward's office, he ushered her into a small conference room where a stack of documents lay on the table. Edward sat across from her, his face serious. "We've found evidence that the officers involved in your case have been implicated in similar incidents before, and this time there are witnesses." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "What does that mean? Are they in trouble?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "It means we've got a stronger case than we thought. But it's going to take more than just a few witnesses. We need to build a coalition, get the public behind us even more. These officers have been involved in multiple complaints of racial profiling, and now we have the proof. But we're up against a system that's entrenched, and we can't afford to be complacent." Sarah's mind raced. She had always known that the fight wouldn't be easy, but hearing it put so plainly made her stomach churn. But now the evidence was on her side. Now the fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had been made to feel invisible. Sarah wasn't just fighting a few officers, she was fighting a system. Edward continued, "We need to prepare for the possibility that they'll come at us hard. They'll try to discredit us, try to undermine everything we've built. But we've got the truth on our side. We can't let them win." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The next few weeks were intense. Edward's team worked tirelessly to gather evidence, to get witness testimonies, and to rally public support. The legal strategy was set in motion, and soon the case would move to the courtroom. Sarah found. But the more the media covered the case, the more Sarah felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The voices of those who supported her were drowned out by the voices of those who called her an attention seeker, who labeled her as someone stirring division. People who didn't understand the real issue, the deep-rooted racism and prejudice that existed within institutions, tried to make her out to be the villain in this story. Every day she had to remind herself that she wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for change. She was fighting for justice, for equality, for the dignity of every person who had ever been treated as less than. The pressure, though overwhelming, fueled her determination. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. The courtroom battle was approaching, and Sarah knew that it would be the defining moment of her life. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. The day Sarah had been both anticipating and dreading had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and even a few supporters who had followed. She could feel every set of eyes on her, the curious stares, the judgment, the questions that hung in the air. There were whispers about the case, about her, and she had a sinking feeling that for some, this was a spectacle more than it was a search for justice. She tried to ignore the noise as her attorney, Ben Harris, greeted her with a brief, encouraging smile. They had prepared for this day for weeks, yet as Sarah looked at the crowd, she wasn't sure she was ready to face the Ben had briefed her on the legal strategy. It was simple but essential: show the truth, expose the evidence, and let the jury see that the officers had acted out of bias, not out of duty. The key was proving that their actions were rooted in systemic prejudice, not an isolated mistake. But Sarah knew that the hardest part wouldn't be presenting the evidence. It would be facing the officers, facing the very people who had made her feel small, less than, and guilty for nothing. The trial began with opening statements. Ben Harris stood before the jury, his voice calm but resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "The case before you is not just about one interaction between two officers and a woman in a park. It is about a pattern of behavior that is rooted in prejudice, bias, and an ingrained belief that certain people do not belong. My client, Sarah Davis, was treated unfairly, simply because of the color of her skin. And today we're here to prove that." Sarah took a deep breath, letting Ben's words settle in her chest. She was no longer just a woman standing alone against two officers. She was part of something much larger, something that was about to unfold in the courtroom. As Ben continued with his statement, Sarah tried to steady herself, focusing on the sound of his voice. She could feel the tension in the room. The officers sitting across from her at the defendant's table looked calm, almost detached. Their attorneys whispered to them, but their faces gave nothing away. Sarah couldn't help but stare at them, the very men who had humiliated her, who had made assumptions about her without knowing anything about her. When it was time for the officer's defense, Sarah watched as their attorney stood up, his demeanor confident and poised. "Ladies and gentlemen," the attorney began, "my clients did what they believed was necessary for public safety. They acted according to their training, according to the law. There is no evidence here to suggest that race played a role in their actions. This is a case of misunderstanding, nothing more." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. How could they stand there and say that? How could they stand there and pretend that it was all just a misunderstanding, when the very core of the incident was rooted in racial bias? She clenched her fists, anger rising within her. This wasn't just a case about one encounter. It was about a system that continually overlooked the experiences of people like her. The courtroom grew tense as witnesses were called. The first witness was one of the park-goers who had witnessed the interaction between Sarah and the officers. The woman, a white woman in her late 40s, nervously took the stand. She had seen the officers approach Sarah, had watched them question her, and had been one of the first to realize something was wrong. "I could see that the officers were being harsh with her," the witness testified. "I didn't understand why. She was just a woman with children, and she didn't deserve to be treated that way." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The officer's defense was crumbling. The next witness was someone unexpected. One of Sarah's co-workers, a man named Greg, who had seen her work for years. "I've known Sarah for a long time," Greg said, his voice steady. "She's a good person. She's a great co-worker. I've never once seen her do anything that would make anyone suspicious of her character." Greg's words were simple but powerful. They weren't about the incident in the park. They were about Sarah's character, about who she was when she wasn't being judged by the color of her skin. As the days passed, the trial grew more intense. Sarah was called to the stand, and for the first time, she was forced to relive the pain of that day. But as she spoke, she found her voice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated like she had. She spoke about the fear, about the anger, and about the moment when she realized that the system was broken, that the people who were supposed to protect her had been the ones to harm her. When the closing arguments came, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. Ben stood once more before the jury. "We've shown you the truth. The officers involved in this case acted not out of necessity, but out of bias. This is about accountability. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. It's about standing up for justice." And with those words, Sarah knew that no matter the outcome, she had already won. She had faced the system, faced the people who had tried to silence her, and had found the strength to speak out. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like justice might actually be within reach. The day of the verdict arrived sooner than Sarah had expected. The last few weeks had been a blur of emotions, tense moments and hard decisions. Now the time had come for the jury to deliberate, and Sarah could feel the weight of everything she had. She sat in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to focus on the present moment, but her mind kept racing. She had spent so many sleepless nights wondering whether all of this, the interviews, the rallying, the legal battles, would lead to a favorable outcome. Would the jury understand the truth? Would they see the officers for what they truly were? Or would this be another case where the system failed? Maria, who had been by her side every step of the way, sat next to her, her face calm but showing the strain of the long days and restless nights. The tension in the air was palpable. The courtroom was packed, as usual, with reporters, lawyers, and spectators. Everyone was waiting for the moment when the jury would return with their decision. Sarah tried not to look at the clock, but it was impossible. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the soft hum of whispers. She could feel the eyes of the public on her, could sense the weight of their judgment. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door to the jury room opened and the foreman stepped forward. The tension in the room reached its peak as everyone held their breath. The judge looked at the foreman, signaling him to speak. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," the foreman said, his voice steady but serious. "We find the defendants, Officer Harris and Officer Willis, guilty of racial profiling and misconduct in the treatment of Ms. Sarah Davis." For a moment, everything stood still. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her chest. The words echoed in her ears as the reality of the verdict began to sink in. She looked at Maria, who was smiling, with tears in her eyes. Sarah could barely contain her own emotions, feeling a rush of relief, of disbelief, wash over her. It was real. It was happening. She had won. The judge banged the gavel, signaling the end of the proceedings. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of cheers and murmurs. Some were congratulating Sarah, others were stunned by the outcome. It felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but at the same time, like the fight was far from over. Sarah stood up, her legs shaky as she walked toward the exit. Ben Harris, her attorney, smiled proudly at her. "You did it, Sarah. This is just the beginning." As they made their way out of the courtroom, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since the day the officers had confronted her in the park. She had started this journey thinking it was just about her, just about seeking justice for a single act of injustice. But now she realized it was about so much more. It was about standing up for everyone who had been silenced, who had been treated as less than, who had been overlooked simply because of the color of their skin. The case had gained national attention, and now, with the guilty verdict, Sarah's fight had become a symbol of resistance, of courage, in the face of systemic oppression. It wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about the institutions that allowed such behavior to thrive. It was about dismantling the prejudices that had been deeply ingrained for generations. But as Sarah walked out of the courthouse, her emotions were a mix of triumph and sadness. The fight was far from over. There were still so many battles to fight, so many walls to tear down. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of hope. She had shown the world that things could change, that people could stand up, and she knew this was just the beginning. The weeks following the verdict were a whirlwind. The media coverage didn't stop. Every day brought new stories, interviews, and headlines, all focused on Sarah and the groundbreaking decision. It was overwhelming, yet it was also validating. For once, Sarah was not just a face in the crowd, not just another person ignored by the system. She had become AS. But behind the public triumph, there was a quiet, personal battle that Sarah was fighting. The media attention had brought with it a wave of praise, but also a surge of negativity. There were those who felt uncomfortable with the way the case had unfolded, those who felt that the media had made too much of a small incident, that Sarah's victory was nothing more than a headline grab. There were the critics who tried to discredit her, to undermine everything she had fought for. And then there were the messages that cut deeper than any of the public criticism. Some were direct threats, others subtle but just as harmful. Sarah didn't show it, but the weight of those messages began to take its toll. The things people said online, the hate that had been directed at her, felt like a constant reminder that the fight wasn't over. Just because the court had ruled in her favor didn't mean that the world had suddenly changed. It didn't mean that people would stop seeing her as less than. Every morning, Sarah would wake up, check her phone, and try to prepare herself for what the day might bring. Sometimes it was a supportive message from a stranger. Sometimes it was a cruel comment, but the cycle was the same. She couldn't escape it. Every day felt like a new test, a test of how much she could take before she broke, before she gave in to the exhaustion that was constantly tugging at her. But through it all, she had Maria. Her friend had been there from the very beginning, through the darkest times and the most difficult decisions. Maria had been Sarah's anchor, her unwavering support system. Even when the world seemed to be against her, Maria was there, offering a reminder of why Sarah had started this fight in the first place. "It's hard," Maria said one evening, as they sat on Sarah's couch sipping tea. "It's not just the case, is it? It's everything. It's the constant feeling of being watched, of being judged. It's the weight of expectations, the pressure to be perfect." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's exhausting, Maria. I never thought this would be the way things were. I thought that once the verdict was in, things would get easier, but it feels like it's only just beginning. The media attention is one thing, but it's the people, the whispers, the stares that get to me. I feel like I'm walking around with a target on my back." Maria looked at her, her expression soft but firm. "I know it's tough, but remember why you're doing this. Remember what you're fighting for. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for every person who's ever been silenced, for everyone who's been told they don't belong." Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She had been strong for so long, but there were days when the weight of everything felt too much to bear. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Maria. I'm tired of fighting." Maria reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to do this alone. You've got people who believe in you. who are with you every step of the way. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture, Sarah. This fight isn't just about you. It's about creating a world where no one else has to go through what you went through. It was those words that kept Sarah going. As much as she wanted to step back, as much as she longed for the simplicity of life before all of this, she knew that she couldn't stop now. She had already come so far, the change had already started, and she couldn't let the world slip back into complacency. The fight for justice didn't end with the verdict. It was just the beginning. The next few weeks brought more of the same: media coverage, rallies, and continued public discussions. But as Sarah looked out at the crowd during one of the larger rallies, she saw something that brought a smile to her face. There were people from all walks of life, men and women of different races, backgrounds, and ages, all standing together, united by the belief that change was possible. That was when it hit her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a world where no one had to live in fear, where no one had to feel less than because of the color of their skin. The fight would be long, and it would be hard, but Sarah was no longer afraid. With renewed strength, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would keep going. No matter the obstacles, no matter the hate, she would keep pushing forward. For herself, for the people who had supported her, and for the world that needed to change. The days that followed the verdict were filled with both relief and anticipation. Sarah had won, but she knew that her journey was far from over. The victory in court was only the beginning of the larger fight, a fight that would not be over until real, lasting change was achieved. The media continued to cover her story, but the intense attention began to settle as new stories emerged in the national spotlight. But for Sarah, the most significant change wasn't just in the public's eye. It was in her heart. She had spent so long fighting for justice, for recognition, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be, to exist without the constant pressure of having to prove herself. It wasn't that she wanted the attention or the accolades. What she craved was peace, the freedom to live without being judged by the color of her skin, to go about her life without the weight of society's assumptions bearing down on her every step. But as the days passed, Sarah began to understand something crucial. This fight wasn't just about her freedom. It was about the freedom of every person who had ever been judged or silenced based on their race, gender, or background. Her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had felt the sting of prejudice, to every voice that had been dismissed, to every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And so she made a decision. She wasn't going to stop here. The victory in court had shown her the power of her voice, and she wasn't going to let that power go to waste. Maria had been a constant support throughout the entire ordeal, and as Sarah sat across from her one evening, she felt a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt before. "Maria, I think I know what I need to do next," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. Maria raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "I'm going to start speaking out, not just about my own experience, but about the systemic racism that still exists, the bias that's embedded in our systems. I'm going to continue this fight, but this time I want to do it on a larger scale," Sarah explained, her eyes alight with determination. Maria smiled, her expression one of quiet pride. "I knew you'd say that. You've already inspired so many people, Sarah. You have a chance to change things, to be the voice for those who are still too afraid to speak up." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with ideas. She knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be people who would try to tear her down, people who would resist the change she was trying to bring. But Sarah had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had learned that the hard way. Over the next few months, Sarah began to speak at events, join panels, and participate in interviews. She used her platform to raise awareness about racial profiling, police misconduct, and the importance of allyship in the fight for justice. She was welcomed with open arms by those who had been fighting the same battles for years, but she also faced fierce opposition from those who didn't want things to change. But Sarah remained steadfast. With every speech she gave, with every conversation she had, she felt herself becoming more confident, more powerful. She realized that the truth was on her side, and no amount of hate could diminish that. As she continued her work, Sarah began to notice something else. The people around her were changing too. Her co-workers who had once kept their distance were now opening up to her. They were asking questions, offering support, and learning about the biases they had unknowingly carried with them for years. Sarah had become a bridge, a conduit for change in a world that was still so divided, but the most significant change came from within. Sarah no longer saw herself as a victim. She had been, yes, but she had transcended that role. She was no longer fighting for justice just because she had been wronged. She was fighting for justice because she understood that it was a fight for the soul of society itself. With each passing day, Sarah felt more at peace with herself. She was no longer burdened by the weight of judgment or prejudice. She had learned to use her pain as fuel for change, and in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. The battle for justice was far from over, but Sarah was no longer afraid of it. She knew that no matter the obstacles, she had the power to make a difference. She had already started to change the world, and she wouldn't stop until it was a world where no one had to fight for their right to exist. The fight for justice had become more than just a personal journey for Sarah. It had become a mission, one that would not only define her future, but also shape the world for those who would come after her. The news of her legal victory and her growing activism had spread far and wide, and Sarah found herself at the center of a movement that was larger than she had ever imagined. As the months passed, Sarah became a beacon of hope for many. Her efforts to bring attention to racial profiling and police misconduct were not just heard, they were felt. People from across the country began reaching out to her, sharing their stories of injustice, their experiences with discrimination. They saw Sarah not just as a symbol, but as someone who understood their struggles. Her story had given them the courage to speak up, to demand accountability, and to fight for their own rights. Sarah had always known that change wouldn't come overnight, but she had never expected to see the ripple effect so quickly. Communities were coming together, organizing protests, lobbying for policy changes, and pushing for reform. The conversation about racial justice was no longer confined to closed rooms or hidden conversations. It was out in the open, and people were listening. But with all the attention came its own set of challenges. The hate messages continued to flood her inbox, and the trolls on social media were relentless. The backlash from those who didn't want to see change was loud and constant. Sarah had anticipated this, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. The online harassment, the threats, the insults, they were difficult to ignore, even with the overwhelming support she received. Sometimes it felt like the hate was louder than the love. Yet in those moments of doubt, Sarah found solace in the people who stood beside her. Maria, Edward, and the countless others who had been part of her journey were there to remind her why she started this fight. They reminded her that the hate she faced wasn't personal. It was the resistance of a system that had thrived on injustice for far too long, and it was that resistance that she had to overcome. Sarah's work began to evolve. No longer just focused on the legal battle, she expanded her activism into policy reform. She collaborated with lawmakers, met with civil rights leaders, and worked with grassroots organizations to create a framework for change. Together they focused on three key areas: police reform, educational equity, and community empowerment. Sarah's first major victory in this new phase of her work came when she successfully helped pass a bill that mandated the implementation of anti-bias training for police officers across the state. The bill had been introduced in the wake of her case, and although it was just a small step, it felt like a significant victory for Sarah and the entire movement. As Sarah sat in the office of her new advocacy group, surrounded by a team of passionate individuals who shared her vision, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The woman who had once been a victim of injustice was now an agent of change. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had given a voice to so many others who had been silenced for far too long. But even with all her progress, Sarah knew that the work wasn't finished. The battle for justice was ongoing, and the road ahead was long. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But Sarah had learned something crucial along the way. Change never comes easily, and it rarely comes without sacrifice, but it always comes to those who refuse to give up. She looked out of the office window where the sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city. She thought about the countless people who had supported her, the people who had fought for their own rights, and the people who had yet to find their voice. She thought about her children and the world she wanted to create for them. This was her legacy, a world where people of all colors and backgrounds could walk the streets without fear, a world where the color of your skin didn't determine your worth or your place in society, a world where justice wasn't just a concept, but a reality for everyone. And as Sarah sat back in her chair, she smiled. She had come a long way, but she knew the journey wasn't over. It had just begun. Months had passed since the court case, and Sarah had become a key figure in the ongoing movement for racial justice. The victory in the courtroom had marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, but the reality of the battle was far from over. Each day she found herself more entrenched in the work, pushing for policy changes, participating in public discussions, and using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had long been silenced. The media coverage of her case had died down, but the ripple effect it had caused still resonated in the communities she had worked with. More and more people were willing to speak out about their own experiences with racial profiling, discrimination, and police misconduct. It was as if Sarah had opened a door, and now the floodgates were starting to open as well. As Sarah walked through the bustling streets of the city one afternoon, she couldn't help but think about how far she had come. There was a time when she would have never imagined herself being the face of a movement. She had spent so many years navigating the world with caution, keeping her head down and trying not to stir up trouble. But now everything had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and she was leading the charge for justice. Despite the progress she had made, Sarah knew there were still battles to be fought. The system that had allowed officers like Harris and Willis to act with impunity was still in place, and it was still deeply entrenched in the fabric of society. She had seen firsthand how hard it was to dismantle these systems, how much resistance there was to real change. But Sarah had learned to see the resistance for what it was, a sign that they were getting closer to making a real impact. The pushback she faced only fueled her determination. Every time someone tried to silence her or discredit her work, she reminded herself of the bigger picture. She wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for her children, for her community, and for everyone who had ever been denied justice. In the months that followed, Sarah had a chance to speak at numerous rallies and conferences, sharing her story with audiences across the country. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged by the system. She was a leader, a voice for the voiceless. She had been given a platform, and she was using it to advocate for change. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Sarah sat down with Maria in the living room of her apartment. They had both been through so much, but they had also made it through together. Maria had been by her side every step of the way, supporting her emotionally and providing her with the strength to keep going when she felt like giving up. "You know," Maria said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about how much you've accomplished. I mean, really, you've changed the conversation. You've made people listen. But what's next? What do you want to do now?" Sarah looked out the window, her gaze soft. "I want to keep pushing for change, but I also want to make sure this doesn't just stay in the headlines. I want real, lasting change. I want to see people held accountable for their actions. I want policies that protect people like me, like us." Maria nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been a fighter, Sarah. You're not done yet." "I don't know if I'll ever be done," Sarah said with a quiet smile. "There will always be another fight, another injustice to tackle, but I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen how much power we have when we come together, when we demand change, and I believe that together we can make the world better." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt at peace. The weight of everything she had been through, the trial, the media attention, the pressure, had not broken her. Instead, it had forged her into something stronger. She had learned how to turn pain into power, how to use her voice to demand justice, and how to inspire others to do the same. As she and Maria sat in silence, Sarah knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but Sarah was ready for it. She had already fought her way through the toughest battle of her life, and now she was ready to fight for a better world. One where everyone, no matter their race or background, could live with dignity and respect. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. "This is just the start," she whispered to herself.